see some new faces, and I see some faces from this morning. So you're making a day of it, and that's great. Didn't know how many people to expect. Didn't have a clue because we haven't been able to do too many programs, but we're glad to be back from the Historical Association. I'm Carol Howell. I'm the president. It's nice to see familiar faces. It's nice to be seen. I am so excited today to be able to present this to you. Let me tell you what we've been doing since early this morning. The brothers Carpenter, Larry, Charlie, and Stan, and they'll tell you a little bit more about it, but we've been celebrating a new signage installation at the battleground site over here behind the school where the cabin is. And please, please, please go by and see that sign. See those 3 signs. Get out, read the signs. We hope that that will take us way further down the road than we were in terms of getting education about the battle and about the history and heritage of Lincoln County down the road for our children and our visitors. Dr. Stanley Carpenter, he is the Emeritus Professor of Strategy and Policy at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He retired in 2020. He also holds a degree from the University of North Carolina, but add to that Florida State University, the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, and of course 30 years in the U.S. Navy, retiring with the rank of captain in 2009. He's the author of several military histories, focusing on the British Civil Wars, the American Revolution, World Wars I and II, as well as historical fiction, action-adventure novels, and he's brought some today. Professor Carpenter is a well-traveled man. He just got back from Greece and Italy on a lecture cruise. He frequently gives historical lectures. We haven't had him before, but we're tickled to death at public libraries and historical associations throughout New England, the Northeast, and the Carolinas, focusing on military and naval history from the ancient world to the modern era. But we're more interested in what happened right here, right down here. And that's why we're here today. So I don't have anything else to say. I would like for you to welcome him and then join us for some refreshments, and then he'll have some books for sale, and enjoy and ask lots of questions, because we're all learning.
If I don't know the answer, I'll make it up.
Make it up.
Well, a couple of administrative remarks. First off, pleasure and honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and wonderful crowd. We filled up the room, Carol.
You did.
Can't ask for anything better. Second thing is we will have a little time for Q&A, question and answers, at the end of the session. The third thing is Carol mentioned the books in the back, and I'll say a little bit more about that when I finish the formal presentation here. And let's see, the last thing. I could talk for hours and hours and days about various topics, and certainly about what I call the War of American Independence, which the reason why that, as opposed to American Revolution, is I regard the American Revolution as really having started in the 1760s and going all the way till its culmination with the signing and implementation of the U.S. Constitution in 1789. That was really the revolutionary moment when the United States was firmly created in place. So the period between 1775 and 83 was really the war period, and so that's why I refer to it as the War of American Independence, or the American War. So, having said that, I could, as I said, talk for days and days and days, but then you would probably remember me by my Roman name, Professor Horace Loquacious. So what are we going to do today? Well, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the events of the battle. Many of you already know those, and certainly when you go down and read the signs, we have a very nice description of the actual events. What I really want to do is put this in the broader context of why the legacy of the Battle of Ramsour's Mill was critically important for what ultimately happened. Now, as I think Larry pointed out this morning, or Charlie, one or the other, that every battlefield park claims they were the place. They were the place where it was decided. And certainly there's a lot of merit to saying that if you look at certain events like Saratoga or Guilford Courthouse, all within the broader context of the American War. And places like Ramsour's Mill are kind of, a little bit, a bunch of loyalists, a bunch of pace. What is important about what happened here on the 20th of June, 1780, is it completely undid, or helped to completely undo, the entire British strategic concept for how you pacify the colonies and win back allegiance, one colony at a time, moving up from Georgia, ultimately through Virginia. I'll mention a little bit about why the Southern Campaign was really the last real great strategic concept on the part of British civil and military authorities. But the Battle of Ramsour's Mill, along with Kings Mountain, and really earlier Battle of Moores Creek Bridge down near Wilmington, were three events that completely undid the Loyalist strategy. So think about what I'm going to say here in terms of Ramsour's Mill, in terms of the larger context, and more specifically, how it completely undid the British Loyalist or Southern strategy, which ultimately led Lord Cornwallis to march into Virginia to where? Yorktown, exactly. So, with that, press ahead, here we go. That's an interesting painting. It's by John Singleton Copley, who actually was a Loyalist. It's from Boston, and it's entitled The Death of Major Pearson. And here's a question for the audience. If you had to say, well, where is that being depicted? Well, what would be your nominees?
Wilmington.
Wilmington. Good guess, but you would be wrong, sir.
I figured I probably was. But I didn't want anybody else to answer.
Yeah, I know. There was that pregnant pause there. Well, most people, when I ask this, they say, oh, maybe Philadelphia, Boston, New York, maybe Charleston. Wrong, 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 wrong. That is the death of Major Pearson, January 1779, on the Isle of Jersey. Where's the Isle of Jersey? Not here. I'm not talking about New Jersey. One of the Channel Islands off the coast of France. And the reason why I put that up there, because it illustrates Britain's strategic dilemma after Saratoga and after the French become involved, because the French actually attempted to invade and conquer Jersey and Guernsey, those islands, the Channel Islands that are British. And they failed, and that's a depiction of the battle in the streets of the major city of Jersey. But what it does is it illustrates Britain's strategic dilemma, because now, by March of 1778, not only are you having to suppress this rebellion in those stroppy 13 colonies, now you have a global maritime war on your hands, first with France, then Spain jumps in 1779, and then the Dutch jump in 1780. Complicated by the fact that Britain's normal strategy for fighting France and Spain was to have a continental ally, like the Austrians or the Prussians or the Russians, supplying the land force. Don't have any of that. So Britain's going it alone in a global maritime war against much of Europe, while, oh, by the way, having to defend the West Indies, Gibraltar, the Indian Ocean, and on top of that, suppress the rebellion in the colonies. So that's why that's a brilliant slide to illustrate that, the island of Jersey. Okay, so the Southern Gambit, which is what I used for the title there. The Loyalist strategy was essentially based on a significant Loyalist turnout, and there was very good reason to assume that there were a large number of Loyalists. There probably were more Loyalists in the Southern colonies than there were Patriots. Quite frankly, though, most people were just neutral. They just wanted to stay out of it, protect their families, their business, their farms, what have you, and you guys go away. But as the war came to the South and people had to make choices, a larger number went over realistically to the Patriot side, but there were thousands and thousands and thousands of Loyalists. of which we saw 1,200 of them right here around the corner. The Loyalist strategy, or the Southern strategy, was basically built on this idea of if the British Army lands, and initially the first event was the taking of Savannah in Georgia, and then eventually Charleston. If you send in the regular army and you pacify and you defeat any Patriot, or more specifically Continental Army forces, one colony at a time, moving up from Georgia to South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, that was about all you could expect. And the expectation was a mass turnout of Loyalists would show up once the Army had defeated the Continental Army and moved on to the next target. The Loyalists would backfill in, restore royal government, tamp down any Patriot activity, and essentially restore the colonies to allegiance. That was the theory undergirding the whole Southern strategy. And there's what it looked like. And that's a map, by the way, that we used on the markers to show the overall context. Look at all the battles, and that's not nearly all of them. In South Carolina, there were more engagements of some type. Now, it might only have been 50 guys on 50 guys, but there were more engagements in the American war in just South Carolina than all the other colonies combined. Most of them were small engagements between groups of Loyalists and folks like Francis Marion, Swamp Fox, you recognize him, Thomas Sumter. There weren't that many huge conventional battles other than, say, Camden, Kings Mountain, Siege of Charleston, but Battle of 96, Siege of 96. But that'll give you an idea there of just how active the fighting was throughout certainly South Carolina and then into North Carolina. Okay, where did this Southern strategy concept come from? Well, there is Lord George Germain. He was the Secretary of State for the Americas. Now, in the British Constitution, in the cabinet, there were 3 Secretaries of State, and they were geographically divided, one for North, one for South, one for the Americas. Wherever something was going on, that Secretary of State was responsible for conducting warfare and crafting strategy and military operations. So this is the guy for the Americas. An unfortunate choice. He was known as a very able administrator, but he couldn't get along with anybody. He didn't get along with the Royal Navy, the Admiralty, the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he was constantly interfering with the commanders in the field, but not really giving them proper strategic direction. And so he basically confused the whole issue. Well, it is from his office, if you will, that the whole Southern strategy evolved. And one of the reasons why it was based on this loyalist output was because there were people in the colonies who, of course, had a vested interest in Britain restoring allegiance, who were feeding information back to London, especially to Germain, that said, all you need is the army to show up, defeat the Continental Army in the field, and thousands of the loyalists will show up. I'll give you a couple of examples. This is from a letter from William Campbell and James Wright, who were the exiled royal governors of South Carolina and Georgia. Sir, from our particular knowledge of these provinces, it appears very clear to us that if a proper number of troops were in possession of Charleston, or if they were to possess themselves of the back country through Georgia and to leave a garrison in the town of Savannah, the whole inhabitants of both provinces would soon come in and submit. Now, there was a prominent loyalist in South Carolina by the name of James Simpson, who was a former Royal Attorney General for that colony. And he was specifically tasked by Lord Germain to determine the level of loyalist sympathy in South Carolina. And here is what he said. Whenever the King's troops move to Carolina, they will be assisted by a very considerable number of the inhabitants. So what you're seeing here is an impression created that these thousands and thousands of loyalists would all turn out and backfill the army, restore royal governance, and tamp down patriot activity. There was another reason why the loyalist strategy was considered sound. considered that up to 25,000 Loyalists actually served in various Loyalist provincial units. Now, this is not militia types that fought here at Ramsour's Mill. This is people that actually enlisted in the British Army on the American establishment in the provincial regiments. And you see a couple represented here. And by the way, very famous provincial Loyalist unit. Anybody know what that, whoa! Anybody know what that was? What unit that might have been?
Which one? Dragoons.
Dragoons. That's the British Legion.
Scumbag.
And we have commentary from the audience. You're getting a full service presentation here. They were primarily raised in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, among Loyalists. And that over there is the South Carolina, might be the South Carolina Loyalists. You can see by the half moon shape that was South Carolina. So a number of units were actually raised, and quite a few fought on the Southern campaign, and actually did pretty good service. So based on all that, commentary and assertions from people in the colonies who quite frankly had a vested interest, and plus the fact that quite a number of Loyalists had actually turned out and served in the Army. So armed with that, the Commander-in-Chief, North America, Sir Henry Clinton, Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton, sent the expeditions initially that took control of Savannah and Augusta, and then in the spring of 1780 came down with the main army from New York City, the siege of Charleston, and on 12th of May, 1780, General Benjamin Lincoln. Ooh, that sounds like a familiar. Yep, if you didn't already know that, that's where Lincoln County and Lincolnton's named after. General Benjamin Lincoln from Massachusetts. He was the unfortunate Southern Department commander. General Lincoln pleaded with the authorities in Charleston, the civil authorities, to, when it was obvious what was going to happen, let me at least evacuate the army. And they said, no, you must stand and defend. And of course, inevitable happened. 5,000 Continental Army troops were surrendered in May of 1780. So it looked like everything was going well. The Army was winning conventional operations. The Loyalists were rising up in the outback or the upcountry. And at that point, General Clinton returned back to New York, which was the major operating base in the colonies, and left in command Lieutenant General Charles II Earl Cornwallis. And he's going to be the field commander in the force in the South until Yorktown. And by the way, that is an actual photograph of the British Army taken in 1780. And if you believe that, I got some great books back there. All right. So there he is, General Cornwallis. What General Cornwallis ultimately found out, to his detriment, was that after events like Ramsour's Mill, like Kings Mountain in October, following on Ramsour's Mill in June, that there was not nearly the willingness of the Loyalists to turn out after those two debacles and defeats. And that's completely understandable. If you've been whacked that badly a couple of times and you're thinking, is this, I'm in support of the crown, the empire, we're British, whatever, but I'm not really sure I want to endanger my family, myself, whatever. And so you can understand that sentiment. So as Cornwallis did exactly what the strategy called for, defeat one Continental Army or Patriot force after another, move north into North Carolina, and eventually into Virginia, what he found is there was not that Loyalist turnout to backfill and restore royal government and to tamp down the Patriots. All right, now let's turn to Ramsour's Mill itself. And you'll notice, I'm not going to touch the screen here, Lincolnton Herald, or I guess it's the Lincoln Herald. So Cornwallis sent orders to North Carolina, and this was in literally just after Charleston, just after he took command. And he said, do not rise up until the main army arrives. Well, at that point, Colonel John Moore, who's a local man, and Major Nicholas Welch, they both were officers in one of these provincial regiments that I mentioned earlier. So they're basically regular Army officers on the American establishment. They came here and they began raising troops. And eventually they got about 1,200 loyalists. They all mustered over here on the hill, set up camp, and that's where they were attacked on that morning of the 20th of June. Now, General Griffith Rutherford, Brigadier General, who was essentially probably I guess he was the senior officer in North Carolina, Continental Army type or North Carolina State Regiment type. So he began raising troops to counter this, and eventually about 400 of them arrived here at Ramsour's Mill under Major Locke, and the initial attack was cavalry. I'm not going to, as I say, go through all the details because most of you already know that, or you can read the various accounts of it, but I just want to hit some highlights. So what initially happened was the cavalry under Captains McDowell and Falls came along the Tuckasegee Road and arrived at the Loyalist camp very early in the morning. They surprised the sentries, who fired a few shots and then retreated back. And that's when the general action started. Now this is an interesting painting. I really love it. And none of these folks, except maybe Colonel Moore and Major Welch, would have been wearing the red uniforms. But it's such a great picture that illustrates a cavalry charge in the period. I thought I'd put it in there. So essentially the battle waxed and waned back and forth as the Patriot infantry came into play and formed line, skirmish line, let's see if I got something like that, on two sides of the hill and began advancing up. Well, the Loyalists formed up, drove the Patriots back down the hill, and then the Patriots, as more men came up, counterattacked and eventually drove the Loyalists out and across the bridge at the mill and onto the other side. Those are essentially the major highlights there. So the Loyalists retreated back. At that point, they raised probably a white sheet, which was the usual let's parley, or not necessarily surrender, but at the time it meant let's parley and negotiate an end to the fighting. Well, it was actually a ruse. The idea was, we've lost the battle, let's get as many people out of here safely as possible. Once the Patriots realized what was happening, they really couldn't do anything because they had suffered so many casualties that they had to send for reinforcements. And so a couple of officers took off to find General Rutherford, who was a few hours' march away, to come and reinforce. But this allowed most of the Loyalists to actually get away. So when the battle was over, only about 50 Loyalists were left to be captured. Most had dissipated. And those of you that were at the event this morning, I talked about our great-great-great-great-grandfather, Captain Peter Carpenter, who was company commander in the Loyalists. He was might have been the only company commander to survive the battle, although I'm not sure about that positively. But he was wounded, not captured, but wounded. So tremendous devastation on the Loyalist side. But about 50 of them were captured after the battle. But essentially, they dispersed and were not going to gather up again. There we go. A battle for a nation. And the reason why I called it that, it was really a battle between two opposing viewpoints. On the one side, the Loyalists, many of them had religious ties. They might have been Anglican, Church of England, or they might have had business ties that would naturally cause them to be more Loyalist. A lot of them, and a lot of your ancestors came from northern Switzerland, the Rhineland area, where there was a lot of deference to whoever's the local authority and whoever was the central government, be it a prince or a duke. And so there was that sentiment that rebellion was very bad. And that would cause a lot of people to be on the Loyalist side. Then on the Patriot side, a lot of these folks were Presbyterians. They were the Scots-Irish, or they were from Scotland directly, or England, where the sentiment was typically against a centralizing government, a monarchy, a centralizing government, and more in favor of local authority, more in favor of local family and community. And so there was that mindset with the very specific ethnicities of the settlers. So if you were to look at a muster list of the Loyalists at Ramsour's Mill, you would find all these Germanic names like Zimmerman, Dellinger, Mostetler, name me a few more. Some of you got it. Reinhardt, Warlick, Rat, yeah. Largely, not all, but largely, as I say, from that southern Germany, Rhineland area where there was a lot more deference to whatever was the central authority, the monarchy, if you will. And then I mentioned also this morning, along the frontier, which is what this was, frontier at the time, there was very much that frontier independence. I'm going to run my family, my farm, my business, and I don't need to be told what to do from some body of aristocrats 3,000 miles away. So very much that spirit of independence and self-reliance, those people also tended to primarily go over to the patriot side. So a number of reasons why these folks were really battling for the soul of a new nation. Or it's like Benjamin Franklin said about America, that we had created something totally new here. And he was absolutely right. So after about 2 hours, the fighting ceased, the fog had lifted, about equal number of dead on each side, 50 or so. Since many people were local, not all, because a lot of people had come from surrounding counties, but certainly folks like Captain Stanley Carpenter, whose home was only 4 miles away, the family came and rescued him. They actually passed a silk handkerchief through the wound in the abdomen to clean it, but he lived on till 1817. So a lot of families came to claim the bodies of their dead loved ones or relatives, but there are still a lot of heroes of Ramsour's Mill still interred up here on the hill. And a lot of them were never identified, particularly ones that would have come from other counties. I would say probably anybody who was relatively local, their relatives would have identified them and taken them home. But there's still some folks up there. So by about midday, General Rutherford arrived on the battlefield with his forces, and that's when they began burying people. It's estimated about 70 folks were unidentified and buried in a mass grave. All right, so why was this all important? Now I want to talk about what happened afterwards, and specifically Guilford Courthouse, which was the next big event in this North Carolina campaign. So there's a very famous quote about Guilford Courthouse from Charles James Fox, who was opposition leader in Parliament. And he said about Guilford Courthouse, "Another such victory will ruin the British Army." And even though Lord Cornwallis technically, by the technicalities of the day, if you held the field at the end of the day, you'd won the battle. Only what Nathaniel Greene was doing was what we call a Fabian strategy. And he executed it brilliantly, particularly at Guilford Courthouse. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But Lord Cornwallis lost 25% casualties. Now, anybody who studies military affairs or was in the military, you know that if more than about 10-15% casualties in any one engagement, that's catastrophic. That's catastrophic. So that's why Fox was calling it "another such victory will ruin." So there's Nathaniel Greene, who, by the way, is from where? Rhode Island. Funny story about him. I guess I got time to tell this. It's a great story.
Down in the world.
He was a businessman, extremely successful businessman. They got an ironworks there. You can actually go to the Greene homestead next time everybody's up in Rhode Island and comes by and visits me. You got a place. He didn't have any military service and thought he should. So in 1774, he joined the Kentish Guards. And this was I will say, an elite militia unit. They were very proud of their drill, their marching, their uniforms. It was a militia unit. Except earlier in his life, Nathaniel Greene had hurt his leg and he walked with a slight limp. So visualize this, very sharp group of soldiers marching, and here comes Private Nathaniel Greene carrying up the rear. They tried to vote him off the island. Yeah, I got a few too. Yeah. That was 1774. Private Nathaniel Greene. What was his rank 1 year later? Brigadier General. In command, it helps to have good friends in high political places. So he was promoted to Brigadier General at that siege of Boston in 1775 that followed Lexington and Concord. And he was in command of all the Rhode Island troops at the siege of Boston. He was later promoted to Major General. I will contend that Nathaniel Greene was the most brilliant strategist of the war. Not a great field commander, not really a great field commander, but he was a brilliant strategist. And he understood that the way to defeat the British Army in the field, and particularly Lord Cornwallis, who rarely lost. Lord Cornwallis was probably the most talented British general in the field, was to dilute and attrite. And that's the phrase I use to describe it. If you can attrite the British Army's manpower and their resolve to continue the war, and eventually you will win. All you have to do is keep fighting, win small incremental victories, prove that you can still stay in the field until British authorities and particularly Parliament gets very tired of pursuing this war. That, of course, is exactly what happened after Yorktown. So dilute and attrite. So at Guilford Courthouse, Greene could have held the field a little bit longer, but he said, nope, we've done what we need to do, and off the field. So technically, Cornwallis won the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, tactically, but strategically, in the big scheme of things, it was a huge, huge defeat. That, by the way, is the reenactment unit, the 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers. How many of you have seen one of these type of reenactment battles where they have the regular troops? Yeah, in fact, Charlie there, he's heading down to where this afternoon? Camden, South Carolina. Every November they do a big reenactment. Yeah, well worth seeing. Come on. There we are. Well, we got the spinning circle of death there, looks like. There we go. Restart the program. Where's my tech guy? He's gone. Okay, I think if I just restart it, I think it will go. So, well, if this thing comes up, the next thing you're going to see is the 1st Maryland Regiment. It's a reenactment regiment, a great picture from a Guilford Courthouse reenactment. There's another big reenactment every March that if you want to go see this, it's well received. The 1st Maryland was probably the best Continental Army regiment around. No, I'm just guessing. Yeah, hope this works.
Restarting now.
Restarting.
Okay. Make sure you use a little technology.
Yeah,
When it works.
go to slideshow.
Just a little technology. When it works. Hey, my key.
You just kill everybody with guys.
Do it.
This, by the way, is a hazard of using a system like
Yeah, I
this. It
didn't
will
give
time out on you.
it. Just found it.
Yeah, it will. It times out.
You're too good.
I've had this problem before in several places. It will time out on you. You have to reset it. Okay, there's the first Maryland.
Be me.
They are an excellent Continental Army reenactment at Guilford Courthouse. Now, here is a quiz question. This is a painting. Charlie, is this a Troiani painting or?
No, it's, I wish you hadn't asked me.
Yeah, you'll
No,
think.
it's not a Troian.
Okay, does anybody know who that is?
I do.
Who is that?
That's you.
That's me. Does anybody know who that is?
I do.
That's
Sure.
sure.
Yeah, that was a great, I guess it was a great photograph that was taken maybe 30 years ago at Guilford Courthouse.
Dale Gallion is,
Yeah.
is the painting.
And he liked it, and he did the painting. This was one of the seminal events at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. What happened was the 2nd Brigade of Guards So that's today, there would be the Grenadier Guards, the Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards. How many of you heard of those guys? Yeah, quite a few. They actually pushed forward against the 2nd Maryland Regiment, which was newly raised and not really well trained yet. And they surged forward, and then all of a sudden the 1st Maryland, you see them portrayed there, came up and began firing at them while William Washington's cavalry came in and hit them in the flank. Now there is a mythology that says Lord Cornwallis ordered 2 Royal Artillery guns to fire into the melee, knowing he would kill his own troops. That did happen, but it was aimed not necessarily at the melee, it was aimed at the cavalry. But the end result was it managed to extricate the guards from this bad situation. So, Guilford Courthouse, sad and fatal effects.
Yeah, Judge David Shank was from here, who was responsible for development of the Guilford Courthouse battlefield and park. There's a statue there for him.
Oh, good, excellent. Sad and fatal effects. So the Army then, because of the casualties, and because of the fact that there was not yet this huge turnout of loyalists, in fact, they got to Hillsborough, North Carolina, and expected hundreds and hundreds of loyalists to show up. And there's an interesting story that's described where a few loyalists would show up, say, very nice, and then leave. And so, sad and fatal effects. Very little showed up. There is Brigadier Charles O'Hara. He was the commander of the Brigade of Guards and Cornwallis' second in command. And he wrote, after the fact, to the Duke of Grafton, who was the former Prime Minister of Great Britain and a very close friend. And here's what he said. Listen very carefully to how he describes the situation. I am certain that in our march of near 1,000 miles through every part of North Carolina, though every means possible was taken to persuade our friends, that's what the loyalists would call it, our friends, to join us. We never had with us at any time 100 men in arms. Without the experiment, meaning the loyalist strategy, without the experiment had been made, it would have been impossible to conceive that government could in so important a matter have been so grossly deceived. Fatal infatuation. So the retreat to Wilmington. Let me back up one here. Yeah, and there you see they came down the Cape Fear River. Well, they expected as they passed through Cross Creek area. What's that currently called? Fayetteville. That was very heavy loyalist and very heavily Scottish Highlander. Very few people turned out. Think back to the Moores Creek Bridge debacle of a few years earlier. Think to the reaction now to what has happened at Kings Mountain and Ramsour Mill. And most of the, even though they were loyalists, they move on your way. And so here's what Cornwallis wrote to Lord Germain about this march down to Wilmington. Provisions were scarce, not 4 days' forage within 20 miles. And to us, the navigation of the Cape Fear River is upwards of 100 miles. The breadth seldom above 100 yards, the banks high, and the inhabitants on each side generally hostile. So not a happy thing. One of the things that Cornwallis had done before he marched into North Carolina in January of 1781, he sent a detachment under this officer, Major James Craig, later General Craig, of the 82nd Regiment, to capture Wilmington. So the idea here was if you captured Wilmington, it provided a port facility where the Royal Navy could come in and load off supplies and reinforcements, then be put on boats and sent up the Cape Fear River into the interior. Has anybody ever done like a raft trip or a canoe trip on the Cape Fear River? Anybody? Well, if you ever do, lots of rapids. And so what they found out was that you could only go so far, and that was it. So all these expected supplies that were supposed to come up from Wilmington never reached the Army. Quest of adventures. So Cornwallis, by this time, highly disillusioned with the lack of loyalist support, and he wrote to his friend, Major General Phillips, the idea of our friends rising in any number and to any purpose totally failed. And to Lord Germain, he also wrote it would be impossible to succeed in that great object of our campaign, the calling forth the numerous inhabitants and loyalists of North Carolina, whilst a doubt remained on their minds of the superiority of our arms. In other words, he had not been able to defeat and crush the Continental Army under Nathaniel Greene. Had he been able to do that, it's likely more loyalists would have turned out, but it didn't happen. And he wrote to Major General Phillips, and this is beginning to show his attitude of futility and saying, what are we doing here? This is not really working. He wrote, I am tired of marching about the country in quest of adventures. So at Wilmington, Lord Cornwallis had to make a decision. He had a number of options. He could return to Charleston. He could sail back to New York, which was, as I said, the main operating base. He could sail or march the Chesapeake to try to combine with forces coming down from New York. He could return to South Carolina to try to mop up the Francis Marions and Sumters of the world. But here's the thing. Having studied Lord Cornwallis for 50 years, that was not in his character. Retreat was not a word Lord Cornwallis would have understood or acknowledged. Not in his nature. So what did he do? That's an audience question there. What did he
Marched to
do?
Yorktown.
He marched into Virginia. So he marched into Virginia, and on the 13th of May, crossed the Roanoke River into Virginia, and that started the last campaign of the American War. That was Cornwallis's crossing of the Rubicon. And if you know Julius Caesar, when he crossed the Rubicon River into Italy, that set in motion the Civil War that eventually brought about the Roman Empire. So Cornwallis's attitude was, go into Virginia, take control, cut the narrow neck there from the Chesapeake across to the mountains, and basically starve out the Continental Army operating now in North and South Carolina. Because Nathaniel Greene, when Cornwallis marched north of Virginia, Nathaniel Greene took his army down into South Carolina, fought a couple of battles, really lost again. But remember, his strategy was not to completely lose, just enough to attract the forces, and eventually all the British forces in South Carolina had to pull back into Charleston. So all the gains of the previous year, pacifying the countryside, gone. So Cornwallis is now in Virginia, looking for a culminating battle to ultimately defeat the Continental Army and take control. This is an interesting letter that expresses his frustration at the inability or the lack of support from Sir Henry Clinton in New York for his operations in Virginia. I love this quote. So to Major General Phillips, he wrote from Wilmington, "Now, my dear friend, what is our plan? Without one, we cannot succeed. If we mean an offensive war in America, we must abandon New York and bring our whole force into Virginia. We then have a state to fight for, and a successful battle may give us America. If our plan is defensive, mixed with desultory expeditions, let us quit the Carolinas and stick to our salt pork in New York, sending now and then a detachment to steal tobacco." So you can see the frustration building in Lord Cornwallis. Well, he was ordered to take up a defensive position. Now, initially, they were looking at a place called Old Point Comfort, which is, if you know Tidewater, Virginia, it's down in Hampton Roads area, Newport News area. So the Royal Engineers went down and came back and said, "My lord, no, the soil is too sandy, it's too soft, you can't build fortifications." So his other option, as dictated to him in orders from New York, from Henry Clinton, establish a position at Yorktown on the York River. Now, I would say that the lowest ranking private probably could look at that and say, well, that's a problem, because you are hemmed in on three sides by water, you're on a peninsula, there's only one way out, basically, unless you control the water. Well, the theory was, or the thinking, if we establish this defensive post at Yorktown, basically build a Royal Navy operating base, then we control the water. Well, of course, that didn't happen. And the siege of Yorktown resulted. And the Franco-American Army marched down from New York under the command of General George Washington. with the French forces under the Comte de Rochambeau. And what is singularly amazing, well, yeah, this thing's giving me problems. What's singularly amazing about this was the lack of, the degree of cooperation. Rochambeau, who had the regular French army, probably should have said, "I'm in command." He did not. He said, "You, sir," meaning George Washington, "you are the combined army commander." And that was kind of extraordinary for a high-ranking French officer. But he did, and the cooperation between these two men was somewhat extraordinary. So they marched their army down to Yorktown, besieged Cornwallis, who had built these defensive fortifications. In fact, let me go back and do that map again. There's the York River, and so around the city of Yorktown, or town of Yorktown, built a whole series of fortifications. How many of you have been to Yorktown, the battlefield? If you haven't been, you really need to go. It's a marvelous place. So the siege work started with initially a first parallel here. That was classic siege work. The War of American Independence was won ultimately by conventional European-style siege and siege guns. Not by Francis Marion and his guys running around the swamp. Not by Mel Gibson. It was actually French siege tactics and siege guns that eventually defeated a conventional force at Yorktown that ultimately ended the American War. So as they moved in, they built the second parallel. That was typical siege work. You build your first parallel, and you build communications trenches, and then you advance in, building parallel by parallel by parallel, and all the time you're bombarding the people that are trapped in the town. By the middle part of October, the British forces had one gun left, one cannon left, and it had 2 rounds left. So if you were being besieged by siege guns and field artillery, it's really, unless you can evacuate or unless you can retreat somehow, it's going to be all over for you pretty soon. The British did try to get across to Gloucester Point. You see that? That was the narrow part of the river, but a storm rose up and that didn't work either. That's a great painting of, I think, the taking of redoubt number 9 or number 10, which was one by one the British fieldworks began to fall. And once the Americans and the French took redoubts 9 and 10, that compromised the whole British line. And at that point, I think Cornwallis is thinking this thing is all over. But there's an interesting story about redoubts 9 and 10. One of the redoubts was taken by Continental Army Light Infantry. This was a night attack under the command of Lieutenant Colonel, do I know? Alexander Hamilton. And the other one was taken by a French unit. But how many of you remember back to the 1980s, there was a George Washington miniseries, came out about 1985. Remember that one? Okay, good. Barry Bosworth, yeah. He played George Washington. I thought he did a great job. But they hired a whole bunch of reenactors to portray the soldiers, which, of course, you do that. Well, when they were filming the attack on redoubts 9 and 10, because it's supposed to be, it was a surprise attack. In fact, the British and German sentries did not realize it was happening until literally they were in front of them. So it's supposed to be a quiet attack, and to make that point, Hamilton ordered all the flints taken out of the muskets so you wouldn't have an accidental discharge. Well, somebody in a filming crew forgot to tell the reenactors, make sure you take off your metal canteens and your tin cups. So I'm sitting here watching this film, and they're going across the field, and I hear clink, 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 clink. Great surprise attack. There we go. And ultimately by mid-October, by the 17th of October, ammunition is low. I mentioned the gun. Council of War, which was what you did in the pre-modern period, is basically bringing all your senior officers together. And they decided in the British camp that the only honorable action action was a surrender. By the rules of war at the time, if you are besieged, an honorable surrender is okay. If there is no hope, and that the only option left is just the wanton destruction of life and property, at that point a surrender is considered honorable. And so a lone drummer appeared on the breastworks beating the parley, followed by a British officer waving a white handkerchief flag. And that was the signal for we need a parley. Negotiations occurred at the Moore House, which is still there on the battlefield, and essentially agreement was made for the surrender of Lord Cornwallis and all his forces. Now there is a very famous painting, I think it's by Trumbull. You see it everywhere. In fact, it's on the rotunda of the Capitol in Washington. I think it's also portrayed. But this is an interesting picture, because how many of you think that British officer in red is Lord Cornwallis? If you do, you would be wrong. That was O'Hara. How many of you think that the officer that he's talking with is George Washington? Nope, that would be Benjamin Lincoln. You see Rochambeau off to the side there on the left, and on the right here is Washington. Well, as the troops marched out, only about half of them marched out, because the other half were down with dysentery. Well, smallpox wasn't as bad in the British Army because they were all inoculated. Mostly dysentery from the sanitary conditions, including Lord Cornwallis. He actually had 3 bouts of malaria during this campaign. So he gave his sword to his second in command, O'Hara. O'Hara actually rode up, and this is not portrayed quite right, but I think the psychology here that Trumbull was trying to get was, here's the British guy on foot, and here's the Americans mounted. But at any rate, he rode up initially to Rochambeau. Well, being a European, O'Hara was actually Irish. Being European, the assumption, well, of course the French guy is going to be in command. So Rochambeau said, oh, no, monsieur, and waved him over to Washington. Went over to Washington, and Washington deferred and said, General Lincoln. And so Lincoln actually had been exchanged. Remember I mentioned Major General Phillips, right, who had been captured at Saratoga, and so they did an exchange, Lincoln for Phillips. So here is Lincoln again, and he actually took the surrender. The normal thing you did was the sword of the commander is presented to the victor, and then the victor returns it. But that's the symbol that you have surrendered, and your surrender has been accepted. So that is the painting depicting the surrender at Yorktown.
And had Lincoln not surrendered his sword at Charleston?
And it had to have been offered, because that was a normal thing, and returned.
Years before.
Yeah. Okay, so what was then the legacy, to wrap this all up? The legacy of Ramsour's Mill is this. It really undercut any significant chance of a large turnout, or even providing logistical support from the Loyalists in North Carolina for Cornwallis and the Army as it marched through chasing Nathaniel Greene after January 1781. And it meant that ultimately the Loyalist strategy was a failure, because it ultimately hinged on 2 things. One, defeating the Continental Army in the field, which Cornwallis did at Camden, at Guilford Courthouse, at a couple other small events, at Charleston, at Savannah. That part worked. But the second part was it required the Loyalists to rise up in large numbers, backfill the army, restore royal governance, and tamp down any patriot activity. And that ultimately failed dramatically, and a large part of the credit for that failure was the lack of Loyalists turning out. And there's one author that made a beautiful metaphor about what went on here. He likened it to a ship moving through the water. And we all know it creates a bow wave, and it creates churn as the screws create that disturbed water. Well, that's like the British Army moving through. But what always happens very shortly after the ship passes through? In the water, what happens?
Calms.
It returns to calm. And so I thought that was a brilliant metaphor for what went on here. So, with that, I'll take any questions.
I thought Cornwallis, I thought they said in Yorktown that he just dismissed trying to surrender, so he was actually sick. That's why he didn't show
I'm
up.
down with dysentery.
The first mistake that Cornwallis made was Clinton had offered him an extra 2,000 troops, but Cornwallis was too proud to take those extra troops because he felt like the loyalists would come to his aid and he wouldn't need those.
Well, that was the assumption, that they figured there'd be thousands of loyalists turning out. And
Wow.
for the reasons that I cited, that's why they assumed that.
And then when he burned his wagons at
Right over here.
Ramsour's Mill,
Mhm.
and that was actually something that he wasn't supposed to do. You did not destroy your government property, or
Well,
property at the ground.
The reason why he did that was because he realized they were moving too slow. If they were going
Right.
to catch Nathaniel Greene, they had to speed up.
Right.
That chase to the Dan River through North Carolina was the most extraordinary events in military history. The fact that in the middle of winter, all they kept was a few wagons to haul salt and some rations, ammunition, and any wounded. And in fact, even Lord Cornwallis, all his baggage, everything went in too. So he slept out under the stars with the troops, the common privates. Now, think about the loyalty issue of your troops when your commanding officer, who is a lieutenant general and a peer of the realm, an earl, is willing to do that. Compare that to John Burgoyne, as in Saratoga, whose wagon train was something like a mile long just for his own personal baggage. Think about what that will do to the loyalty and motivation in the troops. But the reason for burning the baggage was to lighten them up. And there were at least 2 episodes that I know of where the rear guard of Greene's Continental Force was on the north side of the river when the British van or advance guard came on the south side. And there's even one event where the Continentals were unloading because they had pre-staged all the boats and even forced Cornwallis to go wide around to another ford. But there's an event, and I forget which river it is. I want to say it was the Hall River, but it was maybe the Yadkin, where the rear guard of the Continentals were unloading their boats on the other side as the advance force of the Brits came on the south side. They pulled up the artillery and started bombarding, didn't do any damage, but just out of frustration, just firing the guns.
That was at the Yadkin.
Was the Yadkin? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was an amazing chase through the middle of the wilderness in the middle of the winter without any tents. It was just what the soldiers could carry on their backs, and both armies just marched incredible mileage through that. It's always amazed me. There are not many forces that could have ever have done that.
And the point about when he was at Wilmington, when Cornwallis was at Wilmington, he was actually ordered to go to Charleston.
Yeah.
And he defied that order because he wasn't backtracking.
He was not going to go back to Charleston. And that's what I mean. It was just not in his nature to do that. He was very offensive, very aggressive minded, and as I said, supreme self-confidence in his abilities because he just was. What he lacked was he did not have the strategic thinking that George Washington and Nathaniel Greene had. And so that was, I think, his ultimate undoing. Any other questions?
Yeah, and the other thing is about the hurricanes of 1780 that destroyed about half the British fleet that was in this part of the world.
Yeah. The hurricanes were a constant problem. One of the things that I didn't talk about the Battle of the Capes, Virginia Capes, which, by the way, you could read about it in that book back there. When the French squadron came up from the West Indies and the Comte de Graaf, the French commander, basically said, I can stay in North America until maybe mid-November, and then I've got to head back down to the West Indies. So they were constantly aware of hurricane season. You get out of the West Indies in hurricane season, but then you get out of northern waters in the winter. And so that's why he said, 1st of November, I'm gone. I'm back to the West Indies. So a lot of coming together of events really culminated there at Yorktown. And in the post-Yorktown period, essentially by that point, Parliament had said, that's enough. A lot of pressure, particularly from merchant interests who were losing a lot of ships. In the hundreds and hundreds of ships were lost to American privateers, for example, and a lot of pressure on Parliament. Look, end the war. Our bigger concern is Gibraltar, it's the West Indies, it's the damnable French and their Spanish allies. Cut these folks loose. And as a result, interestingly enough, both sides prospered because trade between Great Britain and the United States, after a few years, after about 10 years, just boomed. And so actually it worked out. Let's do lady back here and then over here, Rob. Yes, ma'am.
How independent was Cornwallis's decision making, or did he have to keep referring back to Clinton?
Well, technically, yes, he had to because Clinton was the commander-in-chief. However, Cornwallis would do what he was going to do. There was a 4-month period between the time basically when he burned the baggage here at Ramsour's mill and the time he got back to Wilmington. There was not a single letter passed back and forth because he was running around in the backcountry. And there was constant letters. You can actually read them in the correspondence where Clinton is expressing concern. Well, he violated the orders, but this is what it is. He's done it, so let's just deal with it. A lot of tension and friction between Cornwallis and Clinton because they had opposite concepts of how to win the war. Clinton wanted to basically defend New York City and do operations in the Chesapeake, and that's what Cornwallis was talking about, to our salt pork and desultory expeditions to steal tobacco. That was a direct jab at Clinton's indecisiveness or unwillingness to do offensive operations. So yeah, there was a lot of conflict between the two. Ultimately, there was a pamphlet war back in Britain between the two. I did this, no, you did that, back and forth, and ultimately public opinion and official opinion came down and blamed Clinton for the loss at Yorktown. Cornwallis went on to be, he was elevated to Marquis, or Marquis, which is the next rank in the nobility. He was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He was twice what we would have called later the Viceroy of India, Commander General of India. So he made out okay. In fact, he is buried in India. He died in his second tour as Commander-in-Chief in India and is buried in a mausoleum above the Ganges River. So yes, a lot of back and forth, and Cornwallis believed he should have been in command and that Clinton should step aside. And I think you had a question here?
Got a little bit of new information on Peter Carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
When I was at the archives prior to the pandemic, a good friend of mine pointed me to a document that's located in the Rowan County Court Minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Peter Carpenter arrested for treason.
Yes.
Wounded at Ramsour's mill.
Yep.
So apparently he was captured, even though that's also the first public piece of information I had that said that he was actually wounded at Ramsour's mill, other than family tradition.
Family tradition. There is, they used to be called in England called the assizes, which was that periodic court where the judge would come into town and you'd hold the court. And there are documents, I think it's in Raleigh at the archives, we'll call it the assizes for this county in 1782, and it lists something like 35 prominent loyalists and their disposition, and his name is right at the top. He's the first one. Yeah. And he was assessed over 500 pounds of fresh beef that he had to provide, along with a significant fine. But one of the reasons, this was an odd state, not odd in terms of, well, let me back up. Different, because generally in most colonies there was just a real mixture around of loyalists and patriots. But there were areas of very distinct high loyalism. One would be the Hudson Valley of New York City, and in this state, around here, I mentioned the German settlers, very, very heavily loyalist, and over at Cross Creek, the Scottish Highlands, very heavily loyalist. And basically, the North Carolina authorities were very smart about this. They essentially said, well, look, folks, if you are willing to swear the oath of allegiance, pay the fine, we're going to leave you alone. Now, the loyalists down along the coast, the coastal plain area that were more spread out, a lot of them did leave. A lot went to Bermuda, some went back to Britain, quite a few went down into North Florida, which North and West Florida and East Florida were two colonies, British colonies that did not rebel, heavily loyal. So a lot of people went down there. Up in the north and the northeast, loyalists tended to go into Canada. So Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. But that's very interesting about old Captain Peter. I think if he was captured, more than likely they went to his house and got him.
I think so too,
Yeah.
probably.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, let's do here and here.
I'd like to get a little bit of information. You mentioned the mass grave here of 70. That was made the day after, I guess, the 21st of June. A trench was dug some north to south direction on the top of the hill. Of course, the 70 bodies were buried. And some 200 years later, in 1980, 41 years ago, I was transferred to that site, the Battleground School, as principal, and cleared that area out from a thicket where it was grown up for my third grade students to have a playground. And in so doing, I saw these mass huge stones in the ground, and we had an archaeologist come in and found that this indeed was the site of the mass grave. It was just about 100 yards from where my great-great-great-grandfather, Nicholas Warlick, is buried with his brother on that same site. And that happened to be my fortunate 200 years later to be there in that site.
I think there's also a Hessian soldier buried with the Warwicks up there. He actually was stealing some of Miss Reinhardt's soup. And she surprised him. He took a big gulp of that boiling hot soup, went outside and fell over dead.
Love it. I think we have one more question back. Yes,
I had a question about the Anglican Church, and you mentioned that the loyalists, a lot of them who were Anglican, would become loyalists because they were Anglican. Is that because of religious reasons, or is that because they could vote and other religions could not vote? I mean, Presbyterians could not vote, is that right?
I've never heard that. The Presbyterians could not vote?
I thought you had to be an Anglican voter.
No, there were voting restrictions, but it was usually based on property. I'm not familiar with that.
That was
if that's the case.
But they couldn't hold office, the Presbyterians.
Couldn't hold office?
Couldn't hold office. Also, everybody was supposed to pay taxes, support the Anglican Church. The one thing that really happened here is the Johnston Riot Act, because when the boys blew up the powder over there in Cabarrus County, they were declared as outlaws. Also, the regulators were declared as outlaws, and they were never forgiven for it. They always kept that outlaw. No price on. Well, actually, Adam Reap had a 30-pound price on his head.
All right. So one last thing. I'm going to be back there, and just the boats. The one on the Southern Campaign from the British strategic perspective. That's back there. That's $20. A considerable price cut from what you get on Amazon, because I can get the author's discount. And then for 3 novels. I also started writing a few years back historical novels based primarily World War II, World War I. I brought 3 of them there. Those are $10 each, or 2 for $20, or 3 for $30. Here we are in November, and they make magnificent Christmas gifts. Thank you very much.
Now, while we're getting set, and we do have little refreshments back there, and some coffee and water. While he's getting set, I am, without shame, in promoting the LCHA. So there's some information back there. I brought the brochures that you can learn a little bit more about what we offer. We haven't been able to offer as much during COVID, but we're coming back. We're open 2 days a week right now, Thursday afternoons and all day Saturday. But all you have to do is let me know, and I will open the door for you. And we can research all day, whatever you want to do. I have the brochures. As a member, this is our newsletter. We're going into our 3rd year for our new newsletter. It's called The Historian. This one's about Christmas boogering. Anybody know about Christmas boogers?
My grandpa told me about it.
Christmas boogers. All right, that was a local thing. And, well, actually not, and I'll tell you. And we prepared this booklet just for this occasion. So there are some back there, and you're welcome to take one. And thank you so much for coming.